Okay, in the interest of time, I think we should just get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third workshop in the Tech for Thought series. My name is Arjun Kang Joseph. I run the Knowledge Transfer Program at Carnegie, India, and we're delighted to have partnered with Laksha University to bring you this series. Today's session on CBDCs is hosted by Mr. Jonathan Dharmapalan and Ms. Shehnaz Ahmed. Mr. Dharmapalan is the founder of eCurrency, where he invented and pioneered the method to create central bank issued digital fiat currencies. He is a recognized expert in digital currency with an expansive knowledge of policy and technical requirements for central bank digital currency. Prior to establishing eCurrency, Jonathan was the head of Ernst & Young's telecommunications practice and has over 30 years of experience in the technology and business field. Ms. Shehnaz Ahmed is a senior resident fellow and team lead at the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. Prior to joining Vidhi, she has worked as an associate at the Financial Regulatory Practice at Cyril Amalchand Mangaldas in Mumbai, where she focused on advising leading financial institutions, both Indian and multinational, including payment systems on legal and regulatory issues in India. Today's session is divided into two parts. In the first, Mr. Dharmapalan will take us through the technology of CBDCs. In the second, we'll move to Ms. Ahmed talking to us about the regulation of CBDCs. There will be questions following each speaker's interventions. Unfortunately, Mr. Dharmapalan has to leave us towards the end of the hour, so I'd encourage you to ask any questions before he leaves. Thank you once again, everyone, for registering. Mr. Dharmapalan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Arjun, and nice to be with all of you. I'm calling in from California, so it's a little bit early here, but I have my coffee and I'm ready to go. So most importantly, let's make this a bit of a dialogue. I'll speak for a few minutes, but as thoughts and questions come up, please go ahead and post them, and I'll address them. I'll make sure that I try and cover most of those in my comments. So Arjun, I'll stop every few minutes and give you a chance to look to see if there are any burning questions. Okay, so the topic of central bank digital currencies is now being talked about quite a bit. I would suggest that every single central bank in the world, and there are about 150 odd central banks, is either exploring, studying, or at least considering the possibility of issuing a central bank digital currency. But long before the topic of central bank digital currencies come into being, we have to spend a moment and think a little bit about what is a currency. Currency is in my view, really the formulation of money in a legal context. So money can be simply thought about as a medium and a unit of exchange between people for an attempt to settle debt, to make purchases or make exchanges in some common unit of value that we exchange. There was a time when there was no legal foundation for money, but rather just acknowledgement on the part of people to exchange something in value or something that they can use to count value for purposes of exchange. But that time ended several centuries ago. Over time, the concept of money became something more of a legal concept. And what that meant is that either governments or emperors or kings started to embody money in a certain form that they then authorized and allowed that unit of account to be the sole money that can be used in a country. And that's when the concept of currency sort of took effect. Of course, now currency is simply a unit of exchange that is backed by the state or backed by the sovereign. If we look around the world, the definition of currency and the definition of who the state is that issues the currency has become pretty uniform. And I think I can say that I've probably read close to 100 central bank acts, if not more. And they all pretty much say the same thing. Basically, what happens is that the government of the country says that they're going to set up an entity, usually a central bank, sometimes a monetary authority, give it some level of independence from the government itself. So it's not particularly influenced by politics. And then ask the central bank to be the accountant of their money, meaning allows the central bank to issue currency. And today, central banks issue currencies in a physical form. They delineate that money in either metal pieces, which we call coins, or paper notes, which are essentially security paper under the control, by at least for purposes of issuance, of the central bank. The laws of the country also allow the central bank to enforce certain regulations when it comes to the currency that they issue. And the regulations are sort of very simple. Only the central bank can issue this currency. Nobody else can issue it. And if someone else were to attempt to issue it, it'll be considered a counterfeit. And with that, the central bank is able to control the amount of currency they put into circulation. Okay. So for all practical purposes today, we can think of currency as a legal concept, not necessarily a thing. It is the legal concept that makes the thing possible, and the thing that we see today happens to be notes and coins. Now, I will say that there are some slight variations because of history in some countries, especially countries that have been issuing currency for a very, very long time. And people frequently ask me about those variations. So for example, in certain jurisdictions, the central bank, or the entity known or thought of as a central bank, actually allows other banks to issue the currency. But they still control the amount that's issued. And these are rare occasions. There are probably 3, maybe 4 countries in the world that do this today for historical reasons. And that currency is issued not by the central bank, but rather by commercial banks. But the central bank or the central authority controls how much is issued. So the practical nature of the central bank control over currency is somehow held together. India has some unique characteristics. In India, it is the Ministry of Finance that issues the rupee coin. Again, it's a historical artifact, but beyond the rupee coin, all other currencies issued by the Reserve Bank of India. That is, again, a historical artifact, but with that slight exception, the rules that pertain to the issuance of currency are pretty much consistent around the world. There are slight exceptions in the United States, for example, also, which I'll mention. In the United States, Congress has actually given the authority to print money to the Department of Treasury. So what we think of as a central bank, which is the Federal Reserve in the United States, does not actually create the currency. It is the Department of Treasury that creates the currency. And then they hand it to the Federal Reserve for distribution and circulation. So with these slight exceptions, pretty much the rules around what currency is and how it's issued and who issues it are pretty consistent around the world. Now, once you get past the issuance, the question becomes, what is this thing called currency? Well, the intention of this currency is to pretty much set a baseline for how people go about enabling transactions, making payments, receiving settlement of debt, whatever it is. So it's a pretty amazing thing, actually, if you think about what currency is. It takes away a lot of complexity in the execution of a transaction. Let me sort of give you an example. Let's say I'm a farmer and I raise goats. And my friend across the street is a baker and he bakes bread. And it turns out that one morning I need to eat bread. And so I go to my friend and I say, hey, I'd like to get some bread from you. And the value of the bread, let's say, is 2. But I don't have any mechanism to settle that debt by getting bread from him. So now I have to look at my goat as my medium of exchange, except the value of my goat happens to be 50. It's 50 times as valuable, or in this case, 25 times as valuable as bread. Well, now I have a bit of a problem. I cannot settle my debt for that bread with my goat, or I have to buy 25 loaves of bread to make a fair exchange with my goat. And of course, you have the extreme situation, which is that I have to cut my goat into 25 pieces to execute that transaction. It becomes highly impractical to settle a debt for the loaf of bread I just got from my neighbor with my goat. So this is where currency comes in. If I'm able to have a unit of exchange that is now the 2 we talked about for the value of the bread, and we also have a unit of exchange that happens to be a 50 for the value of that goat, instead of having to kill my goat and cut it into 25 pieces right then and there and give it to my neighbor, I can take out these 2 units, which I happen to carry in my pocket because I had previously sold another goat for 50, and settle that right then and there to execute that transaction. Now, if the state backs those 2 units and says that your 2 units are exactly the same as everybody else's 2 units, I can make this transaction happen not just with my neighbor, but with somebody in the next village or across the country, or even pay my taxes to the state using that same medium of exchange. So this is what creates a level playing field in the world of currency. All of it starts with the state or the country or the government saying that there is a unit of exchange called in India an Indian rupee, and that Indian rupee emanates from the central bank. And once you have access to it, you, just like anybody else, can execute any transaction as long as there's a contract and an agreement to execute that transaction. You don't have to kill your goat or cut it into 25 pieces to make that transaction happen. It's a very freeing instrument. Now let's go from all of those ideas to the concept of what is a central bank digital currency. Well, the central bank digital currency is no different than a central bank physical currency, meaning it is a rupee or a number of rupees in a digital form that only the central bank can create. Nobody else can create it. And as long as I'm holding that rupee in my hand, or those 2 rupees in my hand, I can buy that loaf of bread. Or if you happen to have 50 of those rupees in digital form or physical form or some combination thereof, you can have my goat. That's all a central bank digital currency is. Whether or not the technology exists to create that digital rupee is a secondary, an important question, but a secondary question once we've all understood that a central bank digital currency is no different than a central bank physical currency, which today comes in the form of notes and coins. I'll stop for a second. Arjun, are you seeing any questions or anything popping up?
No, nothing yet, but I think when we get into the weeds a little bit more, we will be able to.
Okay. Now, it turns out that central banks have gotten a little bit more complex than just printing notes and stamping out coins. They have also realized that this rupee can come in another form, which is in the form of an account-based ledger. So it turns out that central banks actually maintain an account-based ledger. When they issue currency physically, and they maintain an account-based ledger. And today, they give access to mostly licensed financial institutions what we typically call banks, to maintain an account at the central bank. And the reason why they allow banks to maintain an account at the central bank is that no two banks actually trust each other. So Bank A will not take Bank B money unless it is central bank money. Now, if Bank B happens to have enough central bank printed notes and can put it in a box and carry it over to Bank A, they'll happily accept it as an instrument of settlement. But if Bank B cannot show up with enough physical cash, then Bank A is not going to happily accept that because they don't know what Bank B just showed up with. For that reason, the central bank allows Bank A and Bank B to maintain what they call a reserve account at the central bank. And when there has to be a transaction between A and B has to make a payment to Bank A, it happens on the central bank ledger as a register of accounts held by these commercial banks at the central bank ledger. And when the central bank confirms to Bank A and B that this particular transaction has been settled on the central bank books, the transaction is settled and complete. So money itself doesn't just come in notes and coins, it also comes in the form of accounts held at the central bank. Now, what's really important here is that all transactions and any transaction taking place in India ultimately settles only in central bank money, whether that's notes and coins or a settlement on the reserve account held for banks by the central bank. Those are the only mechanisms that exist today for settlement. I'm sure you have all heard about faster payments and instant payments and so on and so forth. All of those take place at the consumer or the entity level, and you actually think a transaction has taken place, but in reality, all we have are sub-ledgers of transactions that haven't settled yet until they settle at the central bank. So there is this interesting complexity, even in the account-based form of money, that money settles only in or transactions settle only in central bank money. This is an interesting concept that you have to keep in mind, because when we get into so-called digital currency, we have to remember that there is no other mechanism except central bank money to actually settle transactions. Looks like there's
yeah, so we have a question from Akshay. He says, can't we just use Airtel Money, Ola Money, or any other money instead of central bank digital currencies? Why do we need to complicate things any further? Okay,
so these monies that are frequently thought of as Airtel Money or Ola Money is a relatively new concept, but actually happened to have existed before there were central banks. So over the course of the history of money, various parties, let's say a very wealthy, successful merchant, decided to become the issuer of money in, let's say, that particular town or village. So the merchant said, here are some notes that I'm going to print. You can all carry these notes around, and you can use these notes for purposes of making exchanges. But ultimately, if you want to have a claim on that note, you come back to me and I'll take care of you. Now, some merchants or some financiers held to that promise, and things were generally fine in that village. And in some cases, they didn't hold to that promise. They either refused to honor their promise, or they essentially printed a lot more than they were worth. So as an underwriter, they were not capable of underwriting it. And so people started to get cheated by people creating money in their little universes. The other problem happened when someone traveled from a village where he was carrying that particular merchant's money to another village. When they got to the other village, nobody in the other village would accept that money. So to solve this particular interoperability problem, that's called an interoperability problem, is one of the reasons why central banks were created. Central banks were created to tell all the merchants to stop printing money. And by the way, the concept of this money printed by sub-parties exists in India. It's called hundi. Central banks basically came around and said, no, we're not going to let you do that. The central bank will issue this currency, and you can only make a settlement in an Indian rupee. Well, along comes Airtel, and they create something called Airtel Money. When they create something called Airtel Money, they are no different than that merchant. They're basically telling you, hey, you know what? I will underwrite this money for you. You go ahead and execute your transactions in Airtel Money. And if you come back to me sometime later, I'll certainly honor the fact that I am the issuer of this money, and I'll happily exchange it one for one. And I'm the one who sets the exchange rate, by the way. I'll happily exchange it one for one for currency provided by the central bank for an Indian rupee. And I'm quite certain these companies will actually honor that. But what they're essentially doing, however, is that they're creating these closed loop systems. They're like a village where the merchant has issued currency, and that currency is only valid as long as you're in that village. If you go out of Airtel to somebody else, they're not going to accept that currency. And so now you are in a little bit of a quandary, which is where central bank money comes in. Central bank money unifies all of these closed loops. Airtel could be the party who allows you access to the currency, but the currency itself is not produced by Airtel, is not underwritten by Airtel, but underwritten by a central bank. This is the reason why, as these private monies are starting to proliferate, central banks are wondering, wait a minute, is this a good idea? Now, not everything works until it doesn't work anymore. So one of the risks that central banks see is the possibility that we have a merchant who either cheats or under pressure issues more than they can actually honor. And if there is a claim on that merchant, or the merchant was to somehow default, and there are millions of subscribers here who are now using that money, who then is going to stand for those subscribers because they have all voluntarily accepted this merchant's money? Well, that is a cause for what we call instability. And so central banks are nervous about that instability. And as private monies start to grow, central banks are wondering if there is a better solution. Now, I'll also point out that along the way, it was central banks who actually gave permission for these merchants to go ahead and issue private money. So the central bank itself is in a bit of a quandary. They have actually licensed people to issue monies. And now suddenly they're saying, wait a minute, this is going to be a problem we're going to have to solve. So central banks have to come to the recognition that mobile money as we know it, or e-money, as it's frequently talked about, is a temporary solution. That as people start to transact more and more in digital monies, we need to get to a more permanent solution, which is the central bank doing the issuance. I hope I gave some color to that question.
Okay, our next question is from Vishal. So he's asking about how feasible digital currencies are for rural and agricultural areas because of the obstacles to technology in those areas. Do you have any thoughts?
Absolutely. So I will separate access from what it actually is. And I think I've addressed what it actually is. One of the important things about technology is that we have to always think, we are using technology for public good, let's call it that. And I think about central bank digital currencies as a technology for public good, is to address the access question. Now, it turns out that access is not always guaranteed. And it also turns out that access is not necessarily a central bank problem. It is a much broader societal challenge. In creating a central bank digital currency, there has to be some level of expectation that that particular access problem will get solved by other parts of government and other parts of the private sector. It's no different than the creation of electricity. When electricity was created and pumped into cities, there was a question of how we're going to get this to rural areas. And it's taken us 100 years, actually, to get electricity to rural areas. And it again became a public good issue, and the infrastructure had to go into place. We think that a central bank digital currency will probably get into rural areas a lot faster than electricity. And only because amazing companies like Airtel, and somebody asked about Airtel before, have provided that access. It is one of the most widely used technologies in the world, mobile telephony. And because of it, there will probably be a lot more access to central bank digital currency, but it is by no means 100%. But there should be a goal that we make it 100%. So it's a very good and valid question. By the way, if you go into certain rural areas in certain countries, physical cash is also not available. That's also an access issue. And it's quite frequent that if you go make a purchase in a rural area and happen to use a large value note, someone's running around trying to find change because it's not immediately available. And it happens, but that is not an impediment for the creation of currency. At the end of the day, the goal should be that the currency is available where it's needed to execute any transaction.
Thank you. So our next question is from Adnim. So the question is, what are the risks of central bank digital currencies? Won't it cause banks to have to adopt change all over again? A complicated system will fail in complicated ways, and they've given us the example of the income tax website, and they're saying, why fix something that isn't broken?
I can't speak to the income tax website issue because I'm honestly not familiar with it. But this is now you're transitioning into really the topic I want to cover next, which is, are we going to make this into a complicated, difficult to handle system, or are we going to create something that becomes relatively easy to handle and generally available, at least generally available where we can get the technology into people's hands, or the people already have the technology in their hands to access it. So then it becomes a question, and I want to go back here to remember we talked about currency as a currency and as an account-based money. One of the reasons why we are considering a digital currency rather than account-based money is because the settlement of account-based money is a bit complicated, meaning it goes through multiple layers, starting with your local community bank, working your way through the national banks, and ultimately into some clearing system that settles at the central bank. Currency itself can be exchanged on a P2P basis. In selecting or talking about technologies to exchange currency on a P2P basis, there are essentially two, if not three ideas. One is, can we maintain some kind of a ledger, sometimes talked about as a distributed ledger, for exchange of monies on a P2P basis? Item number one. Second is, can we turn that instrument, or can we turn that record on the ledger into a token, we shall call it a token, that somehow gets exchanged when we execute a transaction on a P2P basis? And then if you take that even further to an extreme, we think about a digital bearer instrument, which is more than a ledger entry, more than a token, but rather a fully self-contained bearer instrument, very much like the physical rupee, by the way, which is a physical bearer instrument that I can hold on a phone or a very simple card or some other format. If we are able to get to sort of this ultimate goal of a secured digital bearer instrument, we should be able to simplify the system so that in a person-to-person transaction or a person-to-merchant transaction, that transaction can take place by exchanging this bearer instrument without having to go through multiple systems or multiple records or multiple ledgers to execute a transaction. It should be as simple as me sending a text to you. That's the goal. Are we there yet? We're getting very close to that. And if it is possible for me to send a text to you, I should be able to exchange a bearer instrument similarly. And we need the technology for that to happen without the bearer instrument somehow getting convoluted or manipulated or counterfeited in the process. So it doesn't have to be complicated as long as we can solve the technological problem for it not to be complicated. And I believe the technological problem has been solved already.
Okay, our next two questions come from Murli. I'm just going to put them both to you at the same time. So the first one is, do CBDCs increase the amount of currency in circulation, or can they be issued without that? Will a fresh infusion of CBDCs cause inflation? And the second is, if the Fed, ECB, and RBI issue CBDCs, can you and I buy US dollars, euros, or rupees bypassing banks and other intermediaries? What will be the impact of CBDCs on foreign exchange service providers? Will it do to WhatsApp? I mean, will it be like what WhatsApp did to telecom and texting?
So let me address the first question. One of the reasons why we allow central banks or ask central banks to be the issuer of currency is to make sure that the central bank is creating and issuing enough currency to execute the transactions necessary out there, but not so much currency that it somehow devalues that particular instrument. It also, by issuing a known amount of currency, you also ensure that there is instant settlement when currency is exchanged. So to your question, if a central bank issues a digital currency, in addition to the physical notes, yes, they will increase the amount of currency in circulation. But a central bank has enough information to know that when they increase that currency in circulation, they may or may not have to take some currency out of circulation. It's no different than when the central bank decides to print new notes. So if they print new notes, they're going to increase the amount of currency in circulation, and then they make a decision that they want to recall potentially some older notes and destroy them to keep that either a constant or to keep it as a known amount that they put into circulation. This is why we ask a central bank to do this job. They have enough information about how much currency is necessary in an economy at any given time, and they're supposed to maintain that equilibrium. By the way, if there are private parties out there all issuing currency with no coordination at all at the central bank level, we could actually cause instability by creating more and more money transacting in the economy with no one having any knowledge of what is actually transacting in the economy. Again, it's an instability issue, it's an interoperability issue, it's a trust issue, et cetera, which is why we ask the central bank to do this job for us. And we ask the central bank to do this job for us with minimal or no political interference. Very important, because political interference can also cause instability in an economy by causing much too much currency to be issued. And there are a few countries that it takes place even today. I won't name the examples, but history has taught us that a central bank that's interfered with doesn't always do the job it's supposed to do. Your next question. If multiple central banks issue digital currency, Let's say the Bank of England does so, the ECB does so, the US decides to do the same, and India does the same. Can you buy US dollars more efficiently? Theoretically, it should be more efficient, but the process by which you buy US dollars is not going to change. It's no different than showing up with Indian rupees to buy US dollars. Somebody in the middle has to be willing to accept your Indian rupees and give you US dollars in exchange. Who are the best parties to do that? Well, the parties that are most or best positioned to do that are those that hold both currencies on their books. So banks typically hold multiple currencies on their books. And interestingly enough, the central bank holds multiple currencies on their books. I don't think the central bank is going to get in the business of buying and selling dollars or euros, but banks will probably remain in that role, and FX merchants will remain in that role, and so on and so forth. But it should be a little bit more efficient if that's what you're asking.
We have one last comment from Vibor. So he says that a physical note is a promissory note. Can you clarify the nature of a digital currency? Is it actually value, or is it a promissory note?
Well, the whole argument about what is a promissory note versus what's the value sort of all came to a close when we stopped backing money with gold or backing money with something else. So in India, for example, if you're holding a physical a rupee or a 10 rupee note, the obligation of the central bank is, if you take it to them and say, I don't want this anymore, you promised to give me something in return. I think the obligation of the central bank is to either give you another note or to give you 10 Indian rupee coins. And that's as far as the promise goes, okay? And the promise is made good by the fact that we trust that if we did happen to go back to the central bank with a 10 rupee note, they'll give me another one, or they'll give me 10 coins. There is nothing else behind it except that particular promise. Now, that is not an empty promise. So, despite the humor associated with that comment, that is not an empty promise. A central bank is essentially counting on the country's economy and the stability of the country, which, by the way, the central bank plays a role in creating that stability, that note's value and that note's ability to execute from day to day remains relatively stable. Meaning, if I'm holding 10 rupees and it costs me 10 rupees to buy a loaf of bread today, tomorrow, that same 10 rupees should be able to buy that same loaf of bread. Now, we have to consider small factors like inflation and supply and demand and a whole bunch of other stuff in that particular formulation. But generally speaking, stability comes in the fact that if I have 10 rupees today to buy a loaf of bread and I can do that, I can do the same tomorrow. And the central bank is trusted with making sure that that happens. In situations where if a loaf of bread today costs 10 rupees and tomorrow costs 30, we have instability. And that, by the way, is why we have a central bank to guard against instability. And you know what happens. If the price of onions suddenly spike in India, there is instability. People get nervous, people get upset. And so to maintain that price stability is one of the roles of central banks. Do they accomplish it? They actually do pretty well. All things considered, central banks are doing a pretty good job in maintaining price stability. So they remain a good party to be the issuer of currency. I have about another 2 or 3 minutes. I can stay on till about 10 minutes before the hour. Should I continue, or shall we ask Ms. Ahmed to take over?
Please go ahead, but just before that, I want to ask Ms. Ahmed if she has any questions to put to you. Or
Not, I mean, not really. I think he has kind of very beautifully set out the conceptual framework for currency and why digital currency came into being. Perhaps one thing that I want to kind of understand, and maybe he will address going forward, is the kind of technologies that central banks are looking at. Because I think one important issue that has come up is the role of distributed ledger technologies in the use of central bank digital currencies. Is there something on that? Is there a particular technology that central banks are looking at when they are thinking about CBDC design?
It's a question I wanted to dodge, Ms. Ahmed, because I am in the technology business and I didn't want to color my comments based on my prejudices about what the technology needs to be. But I will try to be balanced in my answer here. The whole idea of digital currency actually didn't start with central banks. The whole idea of digital currency actually started with somebody inventing something called Bitcoin. Okay. By the way, Bitcoin is not a currency. And I can be pretty firm in saying that. It is not a currency in the way we defined or talked about as currency. It could be thought about as a money, potentially, but it's not a currency. It's not a legally binding instrument. It is, however, a very, very interesting technology that allows for a group of people to come together and to create that instrument and then argue about whether or not it's worth what it was when it was created. And the argument is settled by something that they call proof of work. And the argument is settled by replicating this instrument in multiple ledgers, and all ledgers agreeing that whatever sets of transactions took place prior all match, and we are all sort of sitting at it. The truth is agreed to by all parties. That truth is sometimes called a blockchain. That truth is sometimes called a distributed ledger. Now, it turns out that this particular technology has been used multiple times, so it didn't stop with Bitcoin. Other parties came along and created other instruments and gave them various names. They were all sort of various forms of coins or digital coins. And that was where this whole idea of digital currency became a fascination in the public's mind. One of the reasons the distributed ledger was created is because there was no central authority to guarantee that the coin that was created or the instrument that was created was unique and had characteristics that ensured its uniqueness. Okay. So we had to replicate it in multiple places, and the replications all had to match, and the block had to be the block, and there can be no argument about whether the block is the block. And if there's some kind of an argument about whether the block is the block, then you have something called forking, and it all gets really, really complicated from there on out. Well, the use of a distributed technology like that for a centralized purpose is arguably not the place to start. And that would be my argument. My argument is distributed ledger was created to frankly eliminate the need for a centralized authority. As a result, adopting a technology that was created to eliminate a centralized authority as the same technology for a centralized authority to issue currency seems to be counterintuitive to me. So then you go to what is the right technology? And I believe that once you've established the fact that the currency itself is going to come from a centralized authority, you have to now create, or you have to invent, or you have to develop a technology that the centralized authority can bring under their control and somehow ensure that whatever it is they have created and put into circulation cannot or should not and will not be counterfeited. Okay. And that just about anyone looking at that digital instrument should be able to ensure that somehow it came from the central bank. So if you're able to create those characteristics and give that control to the central bank, that technology should be sufficient. Now, there are other criteria around the issuance of a currency, which then asks about, okay, the centralized authority creates it, and the centralized authority makes sure that this currency is not counterfeitable, then should the centralized authority also be the party that distributes it? Well, there's an argument there, but I would say not necessarily, because the centralized authority creates, or the central bank creates physical currency, but they don't distribute it to the public necessarily. In some countries, they do directly, but for the most part, they rely on the private sector to do their job for them. They ask banks to distribute it. They essentially, without asking, merchants end up distributing it for them, and so on and so forth. So in the digital world, I think something like that would be the most practical way to get digital currency out. Central bank creates it, but relies on a second tier, frequently thought about as a two-tier system, for the dissemination of that digital currency. And for that, you need a technology that can somehow take what the central bank created and give it to commercial banks, and then allow the commercial banks to subsequently give it to the likes of Airtel, for example, who can get in behalf of the public. That would seem to be the most practical route. The use of a technology that was intended to bypass the central bank by a central bank doesn't seem to be the best route. And I think that's being proven out. However, there is so much talk and so much fascination with blockchain and distributed ledger that some central banks, or a lot of central banks, are still studying the possibility of using that technology.
Thank you for that. It looks like we're at the end of the time we have with you. But thank you once again for doing this session. It's been great so far. And we look forward.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And thank you, everyone, for the questions. The questions were fantastic. I'll leave you in Ms. Ahmed's and Joseph's hands. See you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Okay. Ms. Ahmed, over to you. I believe you have a presentation for us.
Yes, thank you so much, Arjun. I think Mr. Dharmapalan has made my job easier because I think he's perfectly set out the entire conceptual framework for money itself, for currency itself, and how digital currency comes into being. I think just give me a second. I'll quickly share a short deck that I have essentially to outline some of the points that I'll be talking about. So the focus of my talk will be mostly on policy considerations and legal issues that are relevant when it comes to CBDC issuance. Now, I think one thing that one has to keep in mind is that in most modern economies, when you talk about central bank money, it exists in two forms. One is essentially your cash and or banknotes that can be accessed by retail users. The other is current accounts that banks and typically financial institutions maintain with the Reserve Bank of India or with any central bank. So now a central bank digital currency is essentially a new form of central bank money that is going to be issued, or that the central banks are exploring. So just to kind of set the context here also, we don't need to get into what is a central bank digital currency. Mr. Dharmapalan has already talked about it, but just to kind of give you a sense, CBDC is it's a not new concept. Central banks have been talking about it for some time, but it's only the last couple of years where it has the discussions around it has intensified. So we, as per a Bank for International Settlement study, which looked at 65 central banks, almost 85% of central banks says that they are looking or they are studying into a possible CBDC. Now, before we get into the policy issues, perhaps I think in terms of 2-3 modules that I wanted to talk about was the difference between a retail and a wholesale CBDC. Now, a central bank digital currency can be issued for retail purposes also. That is in which case, the currency can be used by everyone. for households, businesses, for making payments to businesses, merchants, to each other, etc. A central bank digital currency can also be for wholesale purposes, in which case it will essentially be used for making payments between two financial institutions. Now, in my opinion, typically the far-reaching innovation can actually happen in the retail segment as opposed to wholesale segment, because central bank money in digital form is not really a new concept, because we already have banks holding accounts with central banks. So we might essentially be talking about incremental changes over the existing infrastructure. The second thing that I think Mr. Dharmapalan also talked about is that central bank digital currency can be issued as account-based central bank digital currency, in which case it will be like, for instance, if we talk about a retail CBDC, it will essentially be retail users able to hold an account with the central bank. It can also be a token-based CBDC, which I think Mr. Dharmapalan had talked about in his speech. Then there is a direct CBDC or a tiered CBDC. So now, of course, when it comes to issuance of CBDC, there are various activities that will be involved, right? From developing the core structure to issuance of CBDC to customer-facing activities. Now, in either the central bank can be the only authority which executes all these functions, or else, as Mr. Dharmapalan said, there can be a two-tiered CBDC model where the central bank develops the core system, but you have banks and financial intermediaries which develop services over the systems, which will essentially be customer-facing services. So we'll talk about it a little bit, but I thought that these three forms are essential to understand some of the policy considerations and legal issues that we will discuss about going forward. Now, most of the segments of the my piece here will essentially focus on retail central bank digital currencies. Now, I quickly wanted to also share a couple of findings. Basically, at Vidhi, we had done a track CBDC developments across different countries. And I thought, certain findings that had come up, I thought I'll share it with you. Now, when we look at most countries, what we see is that most countries have either taken a very positive stance towards CBDC issuance, or they have taken a neutral stance. Like, for instance, even if countries are taking a stand that today we are not going to issue a CBDC right now, but we will still continue our CBDC research because there is a possibility that we may have to go and issue a CBDC in the future. The second thing is that most countries are looking at a retail CBDC. Wholesale CBDC experiments typically focus on mostly cross-border payments. Then the fourth aspect of it is the motivation for CBDC issuance. Now, motivation actually varies depending on the stage of economic development and the breadth and depth of the financial sector of a particular economy. So, for instance, when you look at advanced economies, you will see that the policy motivation essentially stems from the need to respond to decline in the usage of cash, or perhaps to promote more competition in the payment sector itself. Now, for emerging economies where perhaps the financial system is not that developed, financial inclusion is an important policy motivation. Now here, these are some of the common policy motivations, because I did note that there were some questions as to, people wanted to understand, why are countries looking at CBDC? Why do we need to think about complicating an entire ecosystem, create a new form of currency when what we have currently works perfectly fine? So these are some of the reasons why central banks are looking at CBDC, and I think it's important to appreciate each of these motivations, so that this will essentially then determine how your CBDC looks like. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the policy consideration is to respond to declining cash usage. So a lot of countries, especially countries like Sweden, UK, which are carrying out CBDC research, they are seeing a decline in the usage of cash. Now, in the absence of cash, or in the case of decline of cash, central banks want to ensure that there is also an alternative for public, which can be in the form of a central bank digital currency. Now, of course, this policy motivation itself may not be relevant for all countries like India, where we have a high cash usage. So and also Japan, which also has perhaps even more higher cash usage as compared to India. But if Japan is also looking into this policy motivation with the objective that tomorrow there is a possibility that there may be a decline in the usage of cash, for which we need to be prepared. So it's a sort of a futuristic policy motivation, but yes, countries are looking into that. The second is supporting a resilient payment system. Now we are seeing how digital payments are being adopted in different countries. Many countries during COVID are also witnessing people gradually moving towards digital payment solutions. So in such a case, operational resilience of the payment systems becomes more important. So a lot of central banks are also trying to kind of understand if this resilience can be promoted through providing an alternative means of payment which is based on central bank money. Now, of course, I think one question that comes here is that, is this the best solution to do this? Because obviously CBDC issuance itself is a huge investment for central banks and governments. So I think the cost benefit analysis of CBDC issuance will be very important. The third policy motivation is essentially from a competition perspective and to promote more innovation in the payment sector. Now, this is typically relevant for countries which are witnessing some form of gaps in their payments ecosystem. Like for instance, there are countries which have talked about how the cost of digital payments is high, how there is lack of instant payment solutions, and there is lack of interoperability in existing payment solutions. So a lot of countries are looking at how CBDC perhaps can, by providing an alternative means of payment or by providing an infrastructure on which the private sector itself can build new and innovative payment services, can promote more competition. Another factor, as I said, is promoting financial inclusion. Now, this is typically relevant for economies which have a slightly underdeveloped financial sector and where there is, a lot of financial exclusion. Now, of course, having said that, I think a question was also raised in terms of how, it will work in areas where perhaps accessibility is an issue. So it definitely, this is a major concern which central banks do recognize, and especially in a country like India, where there is disparity insofar as access to adequate technological infrastructure is concerned, or even disparity in digital and financial literacy is concerned. So these are factors that will have to be considered, and it will not be like a magic solution to bring in financial inclusion for all. It will perhaps be one of the ways in which financial inclusion can be promoted, because it will perhaps do away with the need for many customers to own a bank account with a commercial bank. So that is how central banks are looking at it. The next is improving cross-border payments. Now, cross-border payments typically have been a pain point for various regulators, central bankers, because the process is very inefficient. The process is time-consuming. The process is costly. There are several intermediaries in the settlement of cross-border payments, which makes the entire process inefficient. So a lot of central banks are trying to understand if they can develop CBDC infrastructure or ecosystems that will enable a more efficient transfer of cross-border payments. The other point, I think, is about reimagining the role of central bank in a digital economy. Now, of course, central bank is the issuer of currency. However, with different digital currencies being issued by private entities, with digital payments options being developed by the private sector, I think it's also important for central banks to re-envisage or to reimagine their role in a digital economy as an issuer of currency. The last but not the least, one of the fact, I wouldn't say that this is a policy motivation, but it is definitely a trigger which has intensified discussions around CBDC, is the rise in digital currencies issued by private entities, more particularly announcement of Libra by Facebook. So that was definitely one tipping point in the entire discourse on CBDC. And if you track down CBDC developments over the last couple of years, especially after the announcement by Libra, you will note that several central banks have come forward and have started to openly talk about their CBDC research. Of course, this itself should never be a goal to pursue, CBDC issuance. It should be guided by various other public policy objectives. And also another factor which I think is also relevant is that I think many central banks are also fascinated with the novelty of a CBDC and the possibility of innovation that it might bring to the financial sector. So those, I would say, are some of the reasons why central banks are looking at a retail CBDC. Next, I think we talk about policy motivation, but also I think it's important to talk about concerns and challenges that will arise insofar as issuance of CBDC is concerned. I think the first important consideration is the potential disintermediation of the banking sector. So what is likely to happen and what central banks fear is that the moment you issue CBDC, it may incentivize or it may compel bank depositors to move their deposits, commercial bank deposits, to CBDC. In which case, obviously, the balance sheet of banks will shrink. To deal with that, banks might have to, banks may want to make the deposits more attractive by increasing the deposit rate. Now, if they increase the deposit rate to remain profitable, they will have to perhaps consequently increase the lending rate. So if you look at it, it's a sort of a vicious cycle itself, which means that the central banks are fearing that issuance of a central bank digital currency may, at the end of the day, may even impact the issuance of credit by banks and thereby overall impacting the economic growth. Of course, these are concerns that central banks have, but they are also looking at possible design features to be included in CBDC, which might, which might not incentivize people to, move away from bank deposits and go to CBDCs only. So like questions around whether CBDC should be interest bearing or not, whether there should be a cap on funds that can be, CBDC funds that can be held. So these are questions that central banks are looking at to avoid any sort of negative impact on the financial ecosystem. The second issue is mostly, I think, in terms of accelerating bank runs. Now, this is, I think, relevant. Like, for instance, many central banks fear by providing a safe, liquid, risk-free asset, central bank digital currencies may accelerate bank runs in case of a during periods of financial stress. So this is some prompting people to withdraw all their money or bank deposits and move to CBDC funds. So this is a concern that many central banks have. But I think that this is not a new concern, because it's not like CBDC will only can accelerate bank runs. The possibility of a bank run or concerns around bank runs exist even without CBDC. So, I think that, one has to keep that in mind. The third concern is essentially the competition it will provide to private sector payment service providers. The fourth is about the impact on the institutional capacity of the central bank. Now, CBDC issuance will have a huge impact on the institutional capacity of the central bank, because it will have to develop the core infrastructure. It will have to think about how CBDC will be distributed, how customers will be onboarded, how customers will be serviced, compliance with laws, etc. Now, the question is whether, central banks want to keep it within to themselves, or whether they want to outsource these activities is, of course, a question that they'll have to think about. But in any event, issuance of a central bank digital currency is a huge investment for a central bank, which anyways is already discharging functions relating to, regulating other sectors like banking, payments, maintaining monetary stability, etc. And of course, like any other digital payment solutions, CBDC also brings with itself issues relating to security risks, financial system abuses. So these are broadly some concerns that are there with the retail CBDC issuance. Next, we will quickly talk about some of the features that retail CBDC should have, or countries are looking at. These are some of the features that retail CBDC should have. Before that, Arjun, should we just take up a couple of questions, if you think, because I think there are a couple.
Yeah, sure. So the first question here is, if money gets stolen from my account, it comes back, as it's the bank's job to keep it safe. Being a digital currency, it can also be hacked. What are my legal safeguards if it gets hacked?
Sure. I think, yes, definitely that's what I said. The security risks, like will obviously kind of present itself even in a CBDC ecosystem. It will depend on how the legislative framework works. It will depend on who are the players in the ecosystem and how the attribution of liability works. So if it is entirely the Reserve Bank of India which is handling it, so obviously I think the law has to lay down certain provisions in terms of what will be the liability of the central bank in case there is an unauthorized transaction, just like the way it works for existing payment solutions.
So our next question is from Vishwanathan. He says that, are there any chances of India launching our own CBDC like they launched the BEAM app during the UPI boom? So
Honestly,
I'm going to cover that
So-
later, but if you want to take it now, please go ahead.
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, I think India, I mean, surprisingly, despite being one of the leading jurisdictions on digital payments, India and US are two prominent jurisdictions which haven't really talked much about their CBDC plans. Other than, I think, statements by the governor and the deputy governor, where they have both indicated that they are looking into launching possible pilots into both retail and wholesale segments. But of course, when it actually fructifies or when it actually becomes a reality is obviously, I think everybody is wondering about it. But having said that, I think I think most central banks are taking their time, and rightfully so, because I think there are so many issues that are associated with CBDC. There are so many questions that we have to answer in terms of policy priorities, that I think it's important that all these things are done before a call on CBDC issuance is taken up. Like for instance, Europe, if you look at it, they are saying that we will need like a minimum of 5 years to even do our trials, and also obviously this is going to take time. It's not going to happen very soon. But the good part is that the central bank is looking into a possible CBDC issuance. So I think that's a good start.
Okay, thank you. So our next question is from Murli again. He says, what sort of improvements in cross-border payments can CBDCs bring?
So I think that's what most central banks are trying to figure out. As I said, currently the problem with cross-border payments is that there are several intermediaries, that is your correspondent banks. Each bank has a different standard that has to be adopted for routing money. So that becomes a lot of an issue. The process itself is very time consuming, very costly. So what central banks are trying to do essentially is to come together. And you will see there are a lot of examples, in fact, a lot of experimentation happening under the aegis of the Bank for International Settlements, where several central banks are coming together to figure out how they can design their respective CBDC systems in a manner that it can interoperate with CBDC systems of other countries. So perhaps, as Mr. Dharmapalan said, we might not be able to create a new ecosystem itself, but definitely a more efficient way of transferring making cross-border payments. So I think that's what central banks are looking at. But having said that, I think one issue that typically comes up with when we talk about cross-border payments is that you will need central banks to come together to agree on common standards. You'll have to come, central banks have to think about what will be the legal implications on their domestic laws about this. So I think that's the difficult part of, central banks coming together, agreeing on, common standards about these issues. So, but we are seeing a lot of, central banks coming together. There are different bilateral, multi-country experimentation happening, just to kind of make the process more efficient and, perhaps do away with unnecessary intermediaries, I'm guessing.
So another question from Murli again. So Mr. Dharmapalan suggested a more of a status quoist approach, whereas your view appears to be more disruptive. CBDC is going to end up disintermediating traditional financial institutions. Is this just differing points of view?
No, I don't think I am. okay, I don't really think, yes, I don't think I'm talking about a status quo. I definitely think that central banks need to look into the possibility of issuing a CBDC. As I said, I think as we talk about a digital economy, it is also important to think about the role of central bank. We imagine the role of a central bank in a digital economy, as and when, cash usage declines, as and when, digital payments are, people are, adapting digital payments. But having said that, I do think that there are a lot of policy considerations that have to be thought about before we actually, it comes to CBDC issuance. So I think that's my view right now. We need to look into the possibility of a CBDC issuance, but I am nowhere suggesting that, we should issue a CBDC. I think as a country, it's important for us to understand what are the policy motivations that should essentially govern or guide our CBDC issuance research. That's the part that I think right now I am at least.
Then I think we'll take one last question before we get back to your presentation.
Sure,
So
sure.
from Vishal, we have CBDCs, good news for cryptocurrencies and blockchain.
So I think this is something that I very frequently get in terms of, how CBDC issuance will impact cryptocurrencies. See, personally, I do not really, I see there's a huge distinction between users of cryptocurrencies and the way cryptocurrencies currently operate in India, as opposed to how CBDC will operate. Now, CBDC is going to be an official currency. It is going to be like the banknote that you have in hand, whereas a cryptocurrency today at the most is a sort of a speculative asset. So I don't really think that, it in terms of whether I don't think it will promote crypto assets, or I don't really think that it will perhaps destroy the crypto market also. But what I do think is that innovations around cryptocurrencies, innovations around stable coins are definitely, I mean, these are some of the leading factors that have prompted central banks to think about CBDC.
Okay.
So Arjun, maybe I'll even go through the, sorry.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
Is there anything else?
No, I think we'll save the question. Yeah.
So, okay. Cool. So I think just a couple of, in terms of, I think the features of retail CBDC that central banks are looking at. Now, I think a lot of people also kind of raised questions about the potential impact of the CBDC on the financial sector. Also, how, whether people will adopt CBDC. So these features, I think, are very relevant. That's why, to understand. So one obviously is the fact that a CBDC system should be designed in a manner to avoid any sort of operational disruptions, especially in case of natural disasters and all. The second is availability of CBDC. Now today we have UPI, we have NEFT, RTGS. These all payment systems are available 24/7. So if at all we are talking about a CBDC ecosystem, most central banks are trying to figure out how do we provide a 24/7 CBDC ecosystem. Third question is accessibility. As I said, I think this becomes very important for a country like India, where there is disparity insofar access to adequate infrastructure is concerned. So central banks are trying to understand how the design features can minimize barriers to use CBDC. Like for instance, the Bank of England notes that whether CBDC should be, innovations around CBDC should be such that it's not dependent only on having a smartphone, or how we should think about offline technologies. So that's an important consideration for central banks. Of course, security again is an important issue. Scalability of the technology itself, which should be flexible enough to accommodate transactions as and when it increases in volume and value. Yeah. The next is essentially also about interoperability. Now, how CBDC may interoperate with, other payment solutions. This, I think, also becomes necessary when we are talking about a policy motivation to use CBDC to promote more competition, more efficiency, and innovation through CBDC issuance. So I think it's important to have perhaps an interoperability element. The last point perhaps is extensible. Now, this essentially means that, as I mentioned earlier, CBDC can be designed as a two-tiered CBDC ecosystem where central banks provide the core infrastructure and then you have the private sector developing services over it. So now to enable those kind of participation from the private sector, or to allow private sector to innovate on the CBDC ecosystem, I think it's necessary that the technology is such that it can be extensible. And of course, yeah, I think real-time settlement of payments is another, because I think for when you currently have something like a UPI and IMPS, which provides you real-time settlement of payments, it will be necessary that any sort of ecosystem that the CBDC comes with also has to facilitate such kind of payments so that people adopt CBDC. So these are some of the essential features that central banks are looking at. Now it comes to important considerations for issuance of a retail CBDC. As I said earlier, I think the first primary point is that whether we are looking at a CBDC for retail transactions or whether we are looking at CBDC for wholesale purposes. In India, the RBI Deputy Governor says that we are looking at pilots or experimentation in both segments. So we are yet to see what happens, but typically we are seeing most central banks are looking at a retail CBDC. Then what are the key features of a retail CBDC? We have, I think, already discussed some of the essential features of a retail CBDC. I think these features are important to determine how basically a CBDC will work along with the existing payment solutions, how it interacts with customers, and what will be its impact on the financial sector. So that's the second question. The third question again will be in terms of what will be the role of the central bank. So as I had said earlier, I think central bank digital currency means that this RBI will have to issue several services, especially when it's a retail CBDC. I mean, developing the core infrastructure, customer onboarding, customer due diligence, transaction authorization systems, maintaining security. So imagine, I mean, if RBI has to take up all these services on itself, it's going to have a huge strain on its institutional capacity. So most central banks, in fact, and I will cite the example of Bahamas, which has already launched its CBDC, and China, which has launched a pilot in several cities, are looking at a two-tiered CBDC model where essentially the central bank has outsourced the functions relating to customer onboarding, due diligence, compliance with certain laws to private sector intermediaries. Now, these are regulated intermediaries like your banks, your payment service providers. So an important consideration in CBDC design is essentially if central bank can and will outsource activity to regulated financial intermediaries. The fourth point here is on the legal consideration of issuance of central bank digital currency. I think Mr. Dharmapalan has already kind of laid down very, I think importantly, he has talked about the different concepts of currency, money, and payment instruments. And I think it's very important to understand this distinction so as to, understand the legal treatment of each of these under various laws. Now, when we talk about, when we talk about e-wallets, when we talk about e-money, we are essentially talking about money, but we are not talking about currency in general, because a CBDC will be a direct liability of the central bank, whereas and it will not have any sort of a credit risk, which typically comes with transactions which happen on private money. Like for instance, if you look at e-money, it is not a direct liability of the central bank. It is a liability against an intermediary, which essentially will be a bank. So I think it is important to understand these three concepts of currency, money, and payment instruments so that we can understand the legal treatment of it under various laws. Now, of course, what will be the legislative requirements? It essentially depends on how the CBDC is designed. I mean, in most countries, I think, most countries haven't really gotten to the part of what the legislative interventions will look like, because most countries are still deliberating about, how the CBDC design should look like, why should we issue a CBDC. But I think one important point here that I want to focus is the fact that I think legal consideration is very important, because technology itself cannot create money. So you have to have like a very robust legislative framework for it to, for a currency to operate in a country. Now, I think in terms of, so while I think it will depend on how the CBDC design will determine what legislative interventions may be required, but I'll broadly talk about some of the broad legislative interventions or legal questions that will come up. One obviously is the legal mandate of the central bank to issue a CBDC. Now, for this purpose, I think a lot of, you'll have to look back into the monetary laws of a country to understand if central banks have the express power to issue a digital currency. When you look at India, under the Reserve Bank of India Act, the RBI does not have the power to issue digital currency. It has the power to issue banknotes. Now, if at all we are issuing a CBDC where which is account based, which means that which will allow retail users to hold an account with RBI, whether RBI has that power to open such accounts for retail users? No, it doesn't have. So if we want to introduce a central bank digital currency in India, what we will essentially have to amend the Reserve Bank of India Act to allow RBI to issue digital currency. And this is not something peculiar to India. In fact, an IMF study, International Monetary Fund study, found that almost, I think, more than 60% of the central banks that are members of the International Monetary Fund, their laws don't allow the banks to issue digital currency. Now, and you want an express authority to issue digital currency, because without it, it may expose the central bank to legal risk, reputational risks. So I think that's the first part. The second part is whether CBDC should be granted a legal tender status. Now, this is something that banknotes enjoy under the RBI Act, and in most cases, most central bank laws essentially give a legal tender status to banknotes. Now, what a legal tender status essentially does is that it basically recognizes payment in that form of currency as a valid discharge of your debt. Now, typically, why banknotes are given a legal tender status is because it is easily accessible by everyone. So it's easy to pay in cash, and it's easy to sort of receive money in cash. But I think the question with CBDC is that, as some of you have pointed out, that when there are accessibility issues, is it fair to then confer a legal tender status on a form of currency which perhaps may not be easily accessible by everyone, especially in countries where there is a disparity in access to digital infrastructure? So I think that is an important consideration that central banks will have to think about. The third important point is about the regulation of intermediaries itself in the CBDC ecosystem. If at all, the central bank decides to outsource some of its functions or allows private sector players to come and develop services over the CBDC ecosystem, there has to be specific regulations to govern them. For instance, if you look at Bahamas also, which has already launched the sand dollar, they envisage financial sector intermediaries like banks and payment service providers to build upon the CBDC ecosystem to open wallets for consumers. So even there, a separate framework is envisaged for such intermediaries. Of course, then there are other questions about the implications of CBDC under data protection law, because we know that CBDC issuance may mean that there will be collection of a lot of personal data, a lot of financial data. Second is on prevention of money laundering laws. Currently, money laundering laws essentially, envisage a lot of compliance requirements, especially around KYC, especially around customer due diligence, and also to the extent, central bank digital currencies issue, to what extent RBI will be liable for compliance under this laws, and in what shape and form is something that central banks will have to think about. Then again, if we are talking about a token-based central bank digital currency. Its implications under the information technology laws have to be thought about. Then, of course, criminal laws relating to counterfeiting of currency only. Right now it envisages counterfeiting of banknotes and coins. So I think provisions relating to counterfeiting of digital currency will have to be thought about. So those are some of the other laws which may be impacted or will be impacted by CBDC issuance. And last but not the least, I think one point that I wanted to also focus on when we talk about legal consideration is the privacy related implications and the data governance standards of CBDC issuance. Now, because obviously CBDC issuance, a retail CBDC issuance is likely to involve collection of data, personal data, financial data. So sometimes a lot of concerns have been raised by various commentators about the privacy implications. And the possibility of state surveillance is another concern. So I think when one is thinking about CBDC design, how adequate privacy safeguards are incorporated into the design element of a CBDC has to be considered. Now, in this case, a lot of people also often raise a question that can CBDC be an anonymous, can CBDC guarantee anonymity like cash? Because a lot of people feel like CBDC will be a digital version of cash, so a lot of features of cash which includes anonymity should come into the CBDC. But I think that's not really possible. Full anonymity cannot come with a CBDC ecosystem, considering that one has to also think about the implications of allowing a full anonymous CBDC on financial integrity in terms of how it can further promote money laundering. It may be used as a conduit for illicit financing and all. So I think in that regard, central banks will have to always keep on balancing the policy objectives of maintaining financial integrity as well as ensuring that there are enough safeguards for personal data that is collected as a part of the CBDC ecosystem. So yeah, I think that's broadly it in terms of what I had to say, but happy to answer any other questions that are there.
I think we have one last question, which is a follow-up on your answer to Vishal's question. So a CBDC would be a digital currency. Would they be following the same exchange rates or Forex rates as physical currencies?
Yes, it will essentially be like it will just be like any sort of currency, the Indian rupee that exists. It's just that the form will differ in terms of, instead of having it perhaps as a cash or something, a banknote, we will have it in a digital form. So otherwise, everything else remains the same.
Well, I think that's it. And we're right on time. So much for speaking here. I think between you and Mr. Dharmaparamani, we've had a very comprehensive session. And as someone who knew nothing about CBDCs coming in, I feel like I've got at least a good chunk of the bigger picture. So thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Arjun. Thank you so much for having me.